Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in. I want to do a quick flyover of professional sport outside of the US. Let's try to do it in 10 minutes or less. The idea is just to give you a bonus chapter here. There is no Blackboard quiz related to chapter 14, but I know that some of you are interested in pursuing sport outside of the US, either through a job or travel. And some of you are just interested in it for your group project or personally interested. So let's talk a little bit about the differences between professional sport inside and outside of the US. First, I know most of us, if you look at the arrow, when I say international sport, we tend to think of international football or soccer, and we tend to think of leagues like the English Premier League, or the Bundesliga in Germany and things like that. But obviously, there are many other sports besides professional soccer. So on the left here, you'll see things like the Chinese Professional Baseball League or the Philippines Basketball Association. Obviously, rugby is huge in Australia and New Zealand. And then this is a Chinese table tennis league. So, you know, the world is a big place, and as such, there are a lot of different sports that you might be interested in, and even that there might be really good work opportunities in the future. So a quick overview. Obviously, sport is a global product, but how that sport is managed and governed really depends on the culture that the sport exists. So the North American way isn't the only way of managing sport, even though it's the way we grew up watching. And there are a lot of similarities in sport internationally. Still, you'll notice some pretty big differences between the US and other sports, and particularly we'll talk about European football. But first, a quick cartoon here just to show that even though we often consider soccer to be the world's most popular sport, there's a little link here so you can read on different types of international sports and their global following. The NBA has made some recent, they've caught up a little bit with international soccer as one of the most popular sports in the world. Certainly, though, the recent fight between the NBA Houston Rockets and the Chinese government has limited the popularity of basketball on a global context, but the NBA is probably the most recognized sport outside of soccer. This is a big slide, and I'll spend a few minutes on it, but this is where I compare and contrast the differences between how sport is managed in the US versus Europe. So there are three major points that I want you to notice. First, outside of the US, there are just more layers of governing bodies that oversee sport. Second, league teams or teams within the league can be fluid, and especially in soccer, individual sport teams can move in and out of various leagues, and they're not confined to a professional league like we are in the US. And then finally, players can move through the club systems rather than going from youth sport to college sport to pro sport. The progression is through the club system outside of the US. So first, you know, in the United States, basically, if you are the Los Angeles Angels, you report to Major League Baseball, and that's it. But if you are Manchester United in the English Premier League, you not only report to the English Premier League, you also report to the English Federation of Soccer, the FA, and then even more, from the English Country Federation, you report to the European Federation of Soccer or Association. So this is more of a regional governing body. And then that regional governing body reports to FIFA, the Fédération Internationale Football Association. In other words, there are more layers of governing bodies in international sport than in the United States. So football certainly is organized accordingly, and cricket and rugby, the two more popular international sports, are organized through these more complex governing body levels than the US. A couple more points here about these governing bodies. So each team is an independent actor within the various league. And bargaining, as we'll see later, on player contracts and even the teams within the leagues is not collective. In other words, individual players negotiate with individual teams for their contracts. And we'll get to an example here in the next slide. If you want an overview of the way the English Premier League works, you can click on this example. But let's say, like in the US, the NFL Players Association doesn't represent players in the European leagues in the same way. So players represent themselves to the team, and the team represents itself to the league. But there's no real collective bargaining. It happens at the individual level. This can be a strength because you don't have to get everybody to agree to a particular health benefit for all the players or to a particular contract for a superstar in the league. And yet the drawback is that you don't get the same political power that some of the US players associations have, or on the administrative side that some of the managers have when they group up together. So collective bargaining actually can be a benefit for producing political power, but it can be a drawback to actually getting anything done. You know, the more people you have negotiating, the less efficient it is. Okay, let's move on. The second major difference between the US and international leagues is that in some sports, and in fact, many sports, teams can move up and down to different leagues. So let's use the Manchester United again of the English Premier League, the primary football league in England, and many would say in the world, or one of the highest leagues, I would say. Let's say Manchester United has a really bad year, and I don't know how they did last year. I think they did okay, but not as well as Manchester City, right? I don't know. Send me an email if I'm wrong on that. If Manchester United didn't do very well and they, say, settled in at the bottom spot of the English Premier League based on points, then they would be at risk of being demoted to the league underneath the English Premier League. And there are actually 4 leagues in England. So the English Premier League is the top. So let's say Manchester United was at the bottom. They would be at risk of dropping to the second tiered league. And then let's say the second tiered league, the English Football League, I believe it is, their best team, or the team at the top at the end of the year, could promote to the English Premier League. So basically, the worst team demotes to the league below it. The best team promotes to the league above it. Now, obviously, some of us who are really familiar with the US pro sport leagues would say, wow, that would never work in the US, mostly because we have a minor league system. So the NFL doesn't really have multiple layers of professional sport. If their developmental league, as well as like the NBA, would have a developmental league like a G League, or Major League Baseball would have a developmental league like the minors. The NFL's developmental league is, you guessed it, college football. They don't really have a minor league. So in this way, it would be really difficult for the US Big Four sports to utilize this promotion and relegation system. But certainly in Europe, especially in football, they have a lot of success, and it keeps things really interesting. It's kind of like a wild card race. For those familiar with baseball, it's kind of like a wild card race throughout the year, throughout the season, instead of just at the end where, let's say in Major League Baseball, an outside team that's barely on the cusp of being at one of the top contenders in a division, they could potentially get a wild card bid to compete in the playoffs. But that only happens toward the end of the season. The promotion and relegation lends this excitement to the league because all the teams, both at the top of the league and at the bottom of the league, are always at risk of that end of season promotion or relegation, depending on how they did. So it provides a nice incentive to watch and to root for your favorite team, and even for leagues to compete with each other about who's the best league in a certain sport. Okay, finally, players move through the club system. We already covered this, but really quickly, in the US, if you're an elite soccer player in ASO, you get recruited through a club, yes, but most of the time, maybe soccer is a bad example. Let's scratch that, because soccer in the US follows, more than any of the other sports in the US, it follows an international model. Forget that example. But let's say in football, if you're identified as a good player, you want to go to a good high school to get a good playing experience at, let's say, a Centennial High School in Corona, or a Mater Dei, or an Oaks Christian if you want to go to a private school in Southern California. You want a good football experience, you go to a good high school so that you can get drafted to a good college, and eventually so that you can move into the NFL. In international sport, specifically, let's say European football, you're groomed within a certain club, a local club. It could be a city or a region. And then that club can share you with their higher clubs. And at some point, they can start paying each other for your services. So this is where we get into this idea of a transfer fee. But European players, or even players from the US who want to work and play in international sport, go through the club system and not from high school to the minors to pro. Let's move on. We'll use an example of a very famous and well-known soccer player in the US. Most of you know who Christian Pulisic is. If you do not, he is a 20-year-old US soccer phenom who left high school early, I think when he was 15 or 16, and he went to Germany. So the Borussia Dortmund football club from the German league, the Bundesliga is the German soccer league, acquired him. Sorry, let's start over here. He transferred from high school and signed with Borussia Dortmund. Recently, this year in fact, Chelsea from the English Premier League wanted Pulisic to play for them. So they entered into negotiations with Dortmund. And they finally acquired him, I guess, almost a year ago now. They acquired him from Dortmund, they being Chelsea, for $73 million. So basically, instead of what would happen in the US, where the teams talk to each other, and before free agency, the teams talk to each other. Once the person becomes a free agent, then the player can talk to and negotiate with the team directly. They don't have to go through their current team. Not the case in European football. Pulisic let his team negotiate with Chelsea, and then Chelsea agreed to the terms of Dortmund and paid the transfer fee. So most of the money to sign a player transfers from one team to another. So once this $73 million transfer fee was negotiated, then basically the rights to Christian Pulisic went to Chelsea, and they loaned him back to Dortmund to finish the season, to finish the 1920 season, so that Christian could start with Chelsea in the following year. Remember, because the English Premier League is really the highest level of competitive international soccer, so Chelsea figured, we'll let Pulisic continue to finish the year with Dortmund, and Dortmund paid Chelsea a little bit of money for that, and then Christian gets a new start with Chelsea in the 2020 season. Now, the transfer fee really has nothing to do with Christian Pulisic's actual salary. Once Chelsea worked out the transfer fee with Dortmund, then Christian Pulisic gets to negotiate his actual salary with the Chelsea club. Typically, though, the transfer fee gives good insight into the level of contract that a player will sign. So you'll remember, those who follow soccer, Neymar a couple years back signed the individual teams involved in the transfer fee signed the highest transfer fee in the history of soccer. This isn't really even close, but it's certainly the highest transfer fee that's ever been paid for a U.S. soccer player. And it suggests that Christian was going to sign a pretty good yearly salary. And you see here, the average English Premier League salary for a player is $3.3 million. Pulisic signed a 5-year deal that'll be worth $10 million in 2020. So he's well above the league average, and really the highest paid player from the US in history. So again, contracts are negotiated between the player and the club via the agent, and the league doesn't oversee the final approval of this contract. So for instance, in the NFL or in the NBA, especially related to elite players like this example of Christian Pulisic, the commissioners of those leagues would have the final approval rights, or they could even veto the trade if it threatens to mess with their league too much. So for those who have been following the NBA for a long time, you may remember that the Lakers, maybe 3-4 years ago, were trying to get Chris Paul, CP3, Chris Paul, and the commissioner of the NBA at the time stepped in and vetoed the trade, basically saying this would throw the NBA Western Conference competitive balance out of whack. So he actually vetoed the contract. This can't happen in your